Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the bill and yield myself such time as I may utilize.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased we're considering the fiscal year 2013 Department of Homeland Security Appropriations bill in a timely fashion and under an open rule. Chairman Adderholt has been collaborative and collegial in the drafting of this bill, and I appreciate his willingness to include input from our side all along the way. I'm generally supportive of the funding levels provided in the bill. The fact remains, however, that our subcommittee was forced to accept a reduced allocation for the Department of Homeland Security when Republicans unilaterally cast aside the spending agreement we reached last August, forcing the Appropriations Committee to absorb $19 billion in reductions below the Budget Control Act levels. Largely because the majority broke that agreement, DHS is funded at 1% below the requested level, continuing a downward funding trend for this agency over the past few years. The bill does retain the disaster cap adjustment included in the Budget Control Act agreement. Mr. Chairman, fortunately, despite these circumstances, the bill before us provides adequate funding, I believe, for DHS frontline employees so that they can continue to conduct critical operations along our borders, to protect our nation's airports and seaports, to disrupt the latest plots against the United States and our citizens, and to respond to the spate of natural disasters our country has experienced. I'm also pleased that the bill significantly increases funding for critical grant programs, in marked contrast to the current year's inadequate levels. The bill also rejects the administration's poorly articulated changes to the grant structure, changes that have not been authorized. Specifically, I highlight funding for FEMA's state and local grants are $413 million above the fiscal year 2012 level, and both fire grants and emergency management performance grants are funded at the levels requested by the administration. Equally important, the bill provides improved funding for research and development efforts. The bill contains sufficient resources for the Science and Technology Directorate to fund all high-priority research efforts and some new projects as well. Unfortunately, while the bill appears to fully fund the administration's request for science and technology, in reality it includes $75 million for construction of the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, NBAF, which the administration did not request, in effect reducing funds for research and development efforts. Now, I support the eventual construction of this facility, but I must question the inclusion of $75 billion in limited resources for a project that the President did not request, that remains under review by 2 National Academy of Science panels, and that has unobligated prior year appropriations already that it can draw upon. The bill also increases funding for critical Coast Guard as well as air and marine acquisitions to recapitalize aging assets while also bringing the latest aviation and vessel technologies online to ensure these personnel can operate more effectively. And finally, the bill includes a substantial increase for cybersecurity protective efforts to continuously monitor and detect intrusions to our federal networks from foreign espionage and cyber attacks. Mr. Chairman, the bill does contain some ill-advised immigration provisions. Unnecessary and wasteful statutory floors are set for a variety of programs, such as an arbitrary minimum of 34,000 detention beds, a required level of spending for the seriously flawed 287G program, and an inflexible amount for worksite enforcement. Including these types of spending floors and mandates in bill language limits the Department's flexibility to respond decisively to immigration challenges and is likely to waste taxpayer dollars for no good reason. I also object to the 3 abortion general provisions that were added in full committee. Now, we all know, Mr. Chairman, abortion is a politically charged subject. Numerous restrictions in law have already conditioned and qualified reproductive freedom in practice. Among those are prohibitions on the use of federal funds for abortion procedures, which are specifically applied to Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security by the President's Executive Order 13535, issued on March 24, 2010. Until now, our bill has never touched on the topic of abortion because it's not relevant to the Department of Homeland Security and it falls far outside the lines of jurisdiction of this subcommittee. So these provisions are redundant, they will accomplish nothing, they make no change whatsoever in current law or procedures. They seem designed mainly for political effect. But I tell you, political effect cuts both ways. These abortion riders, while unnecessary, are inflammatory. They're divisive. They should not be included in the final bill. Finally, I also strongly disagree with provisions that withhold the following: 60% of all funding provided to the Secretary, Undersecretary, Chief Financial Officer, 10% of all funding for salaries and expenses at Customs and Border Protection personnel, about 37% for Coast Guard Headquarters Directorate, until they submit numerous reports required by statute. Even more egregiously, these withholdings are coupled with a provision that prevents the Secretary, the Deputy Secretary, the Commandant of our Coast Guard, and the Vice Commandant from using their aircraft. Until certain key reports are received by the committee. These constraints are excessive. They will prevent department employees, Coast Guard leadership from effectively doing their jobs. I support efforts to hold the department accountable, and in fact we included carefully calibrated and targeted withholdings in this bill when I was chairman. But excessive and unrealistic limitations frankly detract from this subcommittee's credibility, and they're likely to be counterproductive. Mr. Chairman, I will close by thanking the hardworking professional staff which has helped craft this bill and has assisted the subcommittee in a bipartisan manner over the course of the year. I also want to thank, as the chairman did, Ben Nicholson, Kathy Kraninger, Jeff Ashford, Chris Mallard, Joe Croce, Miles Taylor, and Cornell Teague on the majority side, and of course Stephanie Gupta on our side of the aisle, Justin Ween from my office. And I want to reiterate my appreciation to the chairman for his efforts to work with us on so many issues and to sustain our frontline federal Homeland Security operations. With that, Mr. Chairman, I